Good afternoon. Thanks for attending. Thanks to Senator Hutchison for the center for this event and for inviting us and our session, which is a conversation with Will Inboden, the UT Provost. Really no introduction necessary. Obviously a prominent Longhorn. Most recently, director of the Alexander Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education at Florida, until we stole him back, and for 13 years. He was here, founded the Clements Center for National Security, was a professor at the LBJ School for Public Affairs, and before that, National Security Council experience, Department of State policy planning staff experience, a staffer on the Hill in both the Senate and the House, and roles with think tanks, including the Legatum Institute and the American Enterprise Institute. I always or often make a joke about moderating a conversation like this with a pro, because it doesn't matter what question you ask, they're going to take it and turn it into the question that ought to have been asked. But that makes it easy. So we normally frame the issue of energy in most respects as a domestic issue. But that's a really incomplete picture, and I think that's part of what we want to address over the next 30 minutes or so. So Will, can you talk both in terms of your experience as a high-level government appointee making policy, but also in your experience as a senior scholar thinking really deeply about history, about national security and all the various things that are connected to national security. What are some of your major observations about the role of energy and energy policy on the national security of the United States and our allies?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and I will answer that directly in a moment, but I do want to make a couple of kind of prefatory comments about what an honor it is to be here. I am just 5 weeks into the provost job, so it's so new, as I was joking with others, that I don't even know what I don't know yet about this new job. But it's, I'm not just 5 weeks on the 40 acres, and I was honored to be here previously for 13 years with the Clements Center for National Security, including having spoken at a couple of previous KBH Center Energy Symposium. And I trust you've heard this from others today, but I'd be remiss in not adding my own accolades. This is a really singular gathering, right? I mean, the fact that all of us can come together from academia, from industry, from the public sector, from national security, students, faculty, practitioners, all around these common themes and these common interests. It's very few other universities in the world where they have this sort of convening power. That's because no other university in the world has the KBH Energy Center. And of course, the inspiration, the vision, the strategy, the energy behind all that is Senator Hutchison herself, and I'm honored to be a longtime friend and colleague of hers. She may not remember this, but we actually first met about 30 years ago when I was a very young Senate staffer, and she was working in the Senate, and I was working for another senator on the Armed Services Committee where she was at the time. And little did I know, if you would have told me then, and that 30 years later I'd be sitting here on the stage proudly as one of the speakers of the symposium bearing her name. It's a wonderful picture of how life in the world can turn. And these are, of course, really, really critical issues. And so turning a little more to Paul's question there, I will offer some reflections as both a scholar and a practitioner. So I spent about 15 years earlier in my career in the national security world, especially worked on the National Security Council for President Bush. But then as a scholar, I'm a historian of American foreign policy and national security. And I'll tell you my takeaway up front in one line, and I think you'll hear this from others this afternoon. National security is energy security, and energy security is national security, and the two are really inseparable. And any national security professional who may not have thought that was the case within our first few days on the job will realize that it is the case. So when I first joined the Bush administration at the State Department and then the National Security Council, I didn't come to work on energy policy issues, but whatever else I was working on, counterterrorism, great power relations with Russia and China, democracy and human rights promotion, any of the other issues that come across our plate, energy issues were just inescapable. And so, policymakers who had previously disregarded energy just realized that's not a luxury you have, right? It is really inescapable. But also pretty quickly came to appreciate that this is a unique source of America's national power overall. It was the case, it's been the case for the last century. It was certainly the case in the early 2000s, but it's much more the case now in our present moment. I actually think we are in some ways in one of our, we have our strongest hand almost in history right now with the energy security that we have and the opportunities there. And we can come back to that. But I do want to do a detour into history and on how the importance of energy security for national security shouldn't surprise us with this observation. If you look at almost every major conflict that the United States fought in over the last 100 years, energy issues are an important part of it, right? Okay, so let's start with World War I. World War I breaks out in 1914. The United States doesn't enter the conflict until 1917. World War I is the first major war where the navies of the war are primarily oil-powered rather than coal-powered. So major transition there, where now our allies and adversaries' navies and our own are much more reliant on oil. And so for the first few years of the war, the United States was officially neutral, but was quietly kind of leaning a little more towards supporting Great Britain and France and Nazi Germany. This is what we were doing. We were sending quite a few of our shipping convoys over to Europe to provide munitions and foodstuffs and oil. And of course, what eventually draws us into the war was Germany, the Kaiser's Germany, engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking our ships, and that's what eventually drew us in. But it's because of our energy our energy dominance in those oil supplies, that was one of the key parts of what drew us into the war. Similarly, it's a little known fact, but Germany also was doing some mischief with our southern neighbor, trying to draw Mexico into the war on their side. And part of that was them wanting to do a play to have more dominance in the Gulf of Mexico, which again would be obviously very damaging for our ability to, our energy autonomy, our ability to ship oil supplies from the Gulf of Mexico and even some of our early offshore drilling there. World War II, same story. Again, many complex causes of the war. It's a two-theater war. You've got Nazi Germany's aggression in Europe and Imperial Japan's aggression in Asia. And of course, every American knows or should know that we enter the war when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The proximate cause of Japan's attack was we had just imposed an oil embargo on them, right? For all of the might of Imperial Japan's army and navy, and it was a very lethal and substantial fighting force, Japan has no oil. And as they were aggressively expanding throughout the Asia Pacific, they were running out of oil to fuel their war machine, and they were reliant on American oil at the time since we weren't in the war. This is why they invade the Dutch East Indies, eventually Indonesia. And so when we impose the oil embargo, that boxes them in. Again, I'm not saying that we provoked the Pearl Harbor attack. This is not conspiracism, but it very much was a proximate cause. Or look at Nazi Germany's aggression in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, right? Again, Germany doesn't have much oil. Hitler needs oil for his war machine, which is a big reason why he made his major play into North Africa, whether it's the Libyan oil fields or an effort to have more hegemony, even though they don't invade, Saudi Arabia itself, effort to have hegemony over the Suez Canal and maintain those oil supplies. And then one of the reasons why Nazi Germany eventually gets defeated, of course, is Hitler's colossal mistake of invading the Soviet Union, overstretching his supply lines, getting bogged down in the Russian winter, but also not being able to maintain the energy, the oil and gas supplies that the Wehrmacht needed. Or we could talk about the Cold War, right? Again, primarily it's a clash between the United States and the free world against the Soviet bloc, the Soviet Union and Soviet communism. But energy issues, again, are inescapable in the Cold War. Whether it's American efforts to prevent Soviet hegemony and dominance in the Middle East, it was the Soviets were trying to do, because that would, of course, lock up so much of the world's hydrocarbon supplies, or American efforts to starve the Soviet Union of its own oil and gas revenues, right? Because the Soviet economy was a mess for decades, but one of the things that kept them going was their oil and gas exports. And throughout the Cold War, especially the Reagan administration, and we may come back to that with another question, the United States was really trying to cut off or at least minimize the oil and gas revenues that the Soviets could get from their exports. And even when you look at moments of our use of force in the Cold War, whether it's the Korean War or the Vietnam War, some of the targeted operations like President Reagan's attacks on Libya in 1986 or Iran in 1988, energy issues are inescapable, right? Even as the United States was developing some more of our own, if you will, indigenous or locally sourced energy supplies, our allies in the war, especially in Europe and in the Cold War, especially in Europe and Japan, were very reliant on energy imports, especially from the Middle East. And so one of America's strategic goals in the Cold War is maintain the open maritime order, maintain those shipping channels so that Middle Eastern oil can get over to our allies in Korea and in Japan to bolster their economies, to bolster their militaries. So part of why we fight Vietnam even is wanting to prevent communist hegemony dominating those maritime shipping lanes in East Asia. Part of why the Reagan administration was so focused on keeping the Straits of Hormuz open, as well as preventing, again, communist domination of the Malacca Strait or the Taiwan Strait, was Japan and Korea and Taiwan, other allies in the region, begging us, please do not let the Soviet Union control those shipping routes, because they could then basically have a stranglehold on our economy because they could control our oil flows. So I could go on, but you get the picture. If you look at the last century of conflict, of geopolitics, even if we don't think it's directly about energy, those energy issues are just inescapable.
Well, let's fast forward a little bit. I'd actually like to go back to one of the history questions a little bit later, but what about right now? Can you comment on the state of some of our really pressing security concerns right now, or certainly recently, which are related to energy, either directly or indirectly? And just to rattle off some of the big ones: China and critical minerals, Iran, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, Russia, gas exports, the Houthis and the Straits of Hormuz again, right?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on our current problems, or maybe just some of our current problems in their relationship to energy?
Yeah, again, there's a lot there, Paul, but I'll try to tackle it and try to be succinct. So let me. So you mentioned a number of individual countries. You mentioned China, you mentioned Russia, you mentioned Iran, and the discrete issues each of them has on these energy questions. And we'll come back to those details. But let me step back and take a bigger picture look to talk about a fairly surprising and unprecedented situation we find ourselves in now with this new geopolitical alignment, and then how energy is such a key driver of it, okay? So just in the last few years, there has emerged a, thus far, completely unprecedented in world history alliance of these four powers: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. All right, and different pundits and foreign policy strategists are coming up with different names for this, like is it the new quadrant of malevolence, right? Is it the Eurasian belt of tyranny, because they all kind of are across the Eurasian landmass? Is it the new axis of evil, right? Well, anyway, the rest of you can have fun over cocktail hour coming up with your new name for these four bad guys, all right? But what's unique about this is most international relations theories, or even most geopolitical strategists, wouldn't have predicted this, because these are four very different countries, very different regimes, and historic rivals, okay? So the story of, if you want 500 years of history between China and Russia, it's 500 years of tension and acrimony. They had a brief little honeymoon in the 1950s with Mao and Stalin for a little bit, but otherwise these are two geopolitical rivals, and now they have pretty different systems. Yeah, they're both authoritarian, but Putin has created this new kind of cult of personality built around kind of Russian Orthodox nationalism and a certain Russian chauvinism. China is still, nominally at least, communist and atheistic. Iran, you don't need me to tell you, is this militant Islamic theocracy, right? Completely inimical both to historic Christianity, which Russia claims to represent, and to communism, which is atheistic. Now, North Korea nominally has that communist, friendship going with China, but Korea and China are also historic adversaries. And in China, it's the only kind of patrimonial communist dictatorship in history. We're on the third generation of the Kim family. No other communist country has ever had those patrimonial descendants like that. And they also are a personality cult. Why am I saying all this is normally, conventional foreign policy wisdom would be those four countries would never get together. How on earth has this happened? And yet it is a case, and it's not just, a casual friendship. It's becoming a pretty robust military alliance, and energy is a key factor in this, right? And then now, those of you who follow energy issues and work on those in the room, this is very self-evident to you, but this caught a lot of geopolitical strategists by surprise. But again, China has voracious energy needs and very little in their own hydrocarbon stores and reserves. Russia and Iran, of course, are two of the world's biggest producers of oil and gas, right? And so China's energy needs, and then Russia and Iran's desperation for hard currency and not having very functioning economies that are producing much else that the world wants, even if they were, they're being sanctioned. China is a critical market for them. And so it's a real, the interests there align perfectly. Similarly, all of them supplying North Korea, which otherwise is a total basket case of an economy. And so it started with those energy needs and those economic needs. And from there, that you can layer onto that, well, they're all dictatorships, right? They all hate the United States. You can see some of these other common interests. And then militarily, North Korea has been providing missile guidance system to Iran's missile program. They provided nuclear expertise to Iran's nuclear program. Of course, North Korea is providing troops to Russia for its aggression in Ukraine. Iran has now become Russia's main drone supplier. So the military cooperation, though the material and weapon supply chains have been layered onto this. But most fundamentally, I think it was really a story of these energy needs. And again, if I think other foreign policy strategists have been paying more attention to some of those energy needs, it would have given us at least a certain predictive factor to understand why, wow, this new alliance, it is a surprise, and it's overridden a lot of those other factors, but at the same time, it shouldn't have caught us so much by surprise. And so that's what I mean about energy issues are just inescapable from national security ones. Now, do you want to go into some of the specifics there?
Sure.
Okay.
So one of the ones that, and I'm very interested in what you have to say about this, but one of the ones that has really caught my interest recently, it was actually the last Energy Center event last spring that I learned a little bit more about China's energy ecosystem, right? And one of the reasons that their drive for critical minerals started much sooner than ours did. But can you describe China's position relative to energy and how it's trying to posture itself, not just with its alliances or friendships, temporary friendships perhaps with these other countries, but how it's trying to position itself across the globe?
Yeah, and really important question here. And thus far, most of what I've talked about, I've been using oil and gas as a little bit of proxy for energy. Okay, and we all know that that's a very insufficient proxy for energy. But historically, those have been, like I said, main ones. But now that we're in the 21st century, of course, as we're developing more diversified energy sources, renewables are a very important part of the story. And I know many of you here are doing really, really good work on that. Well, that has also brought a new geopolitical complication and frankly competition in where China being the source of about, kind of depending on how you size it up, 90% of the world's needed rare earths and critical minerals, and the source of the vast majority of solar cells in the world. So for other countries, including the United States, have a real interest in making some sort of transition to renewables, and I don't mean necessarily a full-fledged transition, but at least making them a more robust part of our suite of energy sources. We are deeply intertwined and dependent on China. And that makes a real vulnerability, right? Because anytime you become dependent on one of your main geopolitical adversaries for critical components of your economy, that's a real source of leverage. And similarly, the rare earths, it's not just about the renewable energy story. Those are also very critical components for a lot of the guidance systems, the telemetry in our missiles, our drones, kind of some of our main platforms for force projection. So this is a real, even though overall the United States, I think, has a very strong hand when it comes to energy security here in the year 2025 and geopolitics, one of the main worries I do have is on this dependence on China. And that's why, as you see President Trump negotiating with with Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders on a broader trade deal, and of course we put some higher levels of tariffs on them. Xi Jinping reacted by freezing up all their exports of rare earths to us, and that obviously really got our attention. And so there's no easy answer on this. Let me say, and others of you may have heard me say in other contexts that one of the challenges of national security policy making is it's the constant deluge of choices of bad news in the inbox, and very rarely is there a choice between we've got a good choice and a bad choice. Too often, much more often, it's about trade-offs. It's about we've got a bad choice, a terrible choice, and an awful choice. And my job as leader of the country, if I'm the President of the United States, is pick the bad choice, right? So we have no good choices right now with this reliance we have on China, but as well as our need to counter their geopolitical aggression. And so where I think this may go is probably some sort of short-term deal with China. I was talking to someone who's been yesterday has been a part of these negotiations with the Chinese, maybe a short-term deal, short-term grand bargain that can last about 12 to 18 months to keep the rare earths flowing. We may ease up some of our tariffs on some of their low-cost exports. There's also a lot of jockeying. China also wants to be sending as many of their students here as possible because they know American universities are very good, and we want to be welcoming to a lot of Chinese students. We also need to screen them more carefully to make sure that they are not agents of Chinese intelligence, for example. So all these pieces are a big part of the story, but what we need to do as a country is rapidly accelerate and diversify our sources of rare earths. We need to be producing a lot more of those at home. I'm normally, very, very pure free market, but this is where we are going to need more government support in the short term to make sure any of our rare earth suppliers, that it's going to be viable for them, commercially viable for them, because it is such a critical part of our national security for weapons platforms, but also for getting us on the path to at least have those options for the clean energy transition. So, but then the other sorts of leverage we have are China is still very dependent on oil and gas imports and becoming more and more so reliant on Iran. There, we have some sources of leverage there too. So it's very much a multi-level game.
So one more maybe specific on some of the current events, and in fact, one of the very last things that you did before you went to Florida was a podcast with Senator Hutchison, and this was the main topic. Can you give us an update on Russia, Western Europe, not the sort of malign group of friends, but Russia and Western Europe and their connection with the energy trade? Are we in a better place now, the same place, or a worse place than we were, say, 2 years ago?
Yeah, we're certainly in a better place now, though not fully where we need to get. And again, many of you will be familiar with the story here, but which I just made a very passing reference to. But over the last 50 years or so, Western Europe in particular built up a tremendous reliance on Russian natural gas imports. Right, this was a real source of tension between the Reagan administration and our Western European allies in Reagan's first term, where Reagan comes into office and realizes that the Brits and the West Germans and the French and some of our other key European allies were building a multi-billion-dollar pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe in partnership with the Soviets. And our European friends said, Mr. President, they said to President Reagan, we need this because we have no other sources of natural gas right now, and particularly with these cold winters coming up, we're desperate for this. And also, this is providing jobs for hundreds of thousands of our skilled workers helping build this pipeline. And the Reagan administration said, well, to Thatcher or to Helmut Kohl, well, we hear you on that. However, we have a number of concerns. First of all, in building this pipeline with the Soviets, you are giving them access to very advanced Western technology that they otherwise wouldn't have, right? Second of all, you're going to be providing them billions of dollars in hard currency, because the ruble was a mess as currency. You're going to be providing them billions of dollars in Deutschmarks and pounds and US dollars. And third, you're going to make yourself very vulnerable to blackmail, right? Because if the Soviets don't like something that you are doing or your alliance with us, all they got to do is turn off the spigot, and then you're going going to have millions of Europeans poured in the streets saying, bring our gas back. And so this has been an issue most recently with our European allies in Russia, but it's a very familiar story. Now, the Reagan administration never found a perfect solution to this, but I'll tell you what happened. It's an interesting, messy story. First, they asked the Europeans nicely, please end the pipeline. The Europeans said, no, nothing doing. We're not going to do it. So then the Reagan administration imposed pretty draconian economic sanctions, not on the Kremlin, on our allies, basically saying, okay, fine, we're going to sanction you. This is such a critical issue. You cannot be building this pipeline. Well, that caused a huge uproar and rift with the allies. Is one of the biggest crises in the transatlantic relationship. Margaret Thatcher flew over to the U.S., went on national TV, and said, "I feel as if I won't try to do her accent. I'm sure some AI chatbot can do it for you. She said, I feel as if I've been stabbed in the back by my closest friend, right? Deeply wounded." So Reagan then decides, all right, we're going to go and ease back on the sanctions. This is just causing too much trouble, and then we'll kind of tell the Europeans that they can go ahead and go forward with the pipeline. So that's what was known up until about 1983, and then it seems like going. But then over the next couple of years, there occur a number of mysterious explosions of this pipeline in Siberia. Boom, boom, boom. And all of a sudden, a lot of those gas supplies are drying up, and the pipeline, they'll repair it, then it blows up again. Anyway, what we now know is Reagan said, okay, well, he's up on the sanctions. And then he told Bill Casey, as CIA director, let's do a covert action here. And so what the CIA did is they basically put some primitive forms of malware in, they sabotaged the pipeline, and just blew it up in the Soviet Union. And we kind of, I don't know how that happened, right? So anyway, so that's how we got through that one. Well, anyway, fast forward a few decades later, we have the same issue. You've got this, newly belligerent ruler in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, who is making aggressive noises towards Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and our Western European allies are once again, building the Nord Stream pipeline with him, and we have that same security dilemma, if you will, of energy and economic reliance and independence, while there is growing security tension and belligerence. And this, of course, was all accentuated with the Ukraine war. As awful as the Ukraine war has been and continues to be, it did shock the Europeans out of this, I think, false sense of naivete they had about Russia being a reliable supplier. And so the Europeans have, with active partnership from us, built some LNG terminals, are now diversifying their sources. We're getting more American LNG exports there. They still are reliant on some Russian gas, and Russia has thus far not cut off too much of it because Russians need the money. But it's at least Russia doesn't have quite the level of leverage that they did before.
So if we can go back to history now, and we'll actually go back further than Reagan to the decade before Reagan, and the Nixon, Ford administrations, the Carter administrations, and maybe if it's all right, if we could start with Bill Clements, former Governor Bill Clements, and a titan in the energy industry, sort of a titan in Texas politics, certainly, and also a titan in national security with his time as Deputy Secretary of Defense. What you have studied, while it's not your first area of emphasis, you've certainly studied some of these things, and you've looked through a lot of the primary documents. What are your reflections on what he may say based on his experience in so much of what happened in the 70s, the oil crisis, everything else?
Thanks. Well, I appreciate this friendly question, Paul. And of course, with you and Joe McGuire now leading the Clements Center for National Security, you're doing a great job of carrying forward his legacy as well. And this is why I think the Clements Center and the KBH Center have been such good partners. But the Bill Clements story is a really fascinating one. It touches on, again, a lot of the themes of this symposium, a lot of the work all of you do here. Very briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar, he attended UT for a year in the 1930s. The Depression hit. He dropped out. He moved to South Texas when he was 18 to work as a roughneck in the oil fields. Never went back to college, but had a kind of that great American innate practical genius for invention and innovation. So he, kind of in his spare time, designs a new, better offshore drilling rig. Founds Sedco, which becomes the world's largest offshore drilling company. Eventually, by the 60s, builds a multi-million-dollar a multi-billion-dollar enterprise there, active on almost every continent, and then sells it to Schlumberger. And then in 1973, President Nixon just won re-election, and Bill Clements had always had an interest in national security and in public service. And when President Nixon asked him, would you be willing to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense, which is, it's like the number 2 at the Pentagon, right? It's like the CO of the Pentagon. Bill Clements said absolutely. And this is where I think it's a remarkable story of how he was able to draw on both his expertise from the energy industry, as well as just his expertise as an entrepreneur and an innovator, and like I said, very, very successful designer of new drilling equipment, to bring that into the Pentagon at a desperately needed time. And so just to recap on the real crisis that America was facing when he took the helm there in the Pentagon, the week before he was sworn in, the last American troops had just withdrawn from Vietnam. And so it's a very costly war for us. It's our first lost war in our country's history. We're very demoralized as a history. The military, of course, is very demoralized. They're demoralized about the loss in Vietnam, but they're also demoralized because of the disdain that the American people were expressing to them, right? And it remains to this day a disgrace how horribly we treated our returning troops from Vietnam. But he also comes in at a time when Congress has lost all appetite for spending on defense and supporting defense spending. And so the Pentagon is not only spiritually and emotionally demoralized, it is also nearly bankrupt, right, as Congress is slashing our defense budget. And then America's geopolitical hand is very, very weakened because just as we're reeling from the loss in Vietnam, you then have the Yom Kippur War break out, and because of our early support for Israel, OPEC slaps that oil embargo on us. And at the time, we were much more reliant on oil and gas imports, especially from the Middle East. And so it really cripples America in that way too. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union seems to be advancing across the globe as nations are falling on almost every continent to armed communist revolution. And so what Bill Clements does is he works with Henry Kissinger, with Jim Schlesinger, with President Nixon and others to devise a new defense strategy, drawing on his expertise from the oil and gas industry and the private sector to do more with less. And he says, all right, I still believe in America's fundamental strengths, and I think that we can draw on private sector expertise and our history of technological innovation, that we don't need to keep pace with the Soviets militarily in terms of building tank for tank or plane for plane or ship for ship. We're not just going to try to outbuild them, we can outsmart them. And so he brings in an incredibly talented crew of his senior team in the Pentagon, many of them coming from industry, many coming from the oil and gas industry in particular, and says, all right, help us design the next generation of weapon systems which will so outclass the Soviets that we can do this with more efficiency, but also with more lethality. And so drawing on that private sector expertise, and America's, like I said, great tradition of technology and innovation. In the 4 years as head of the Pentagon, Bill Clements becomes the father of the cruise missile, which we're still using today, which was really important because it was the first missile we developed that could actually go underneath Soviet radar, right? It terrified the Kremlin. Develops the M1 tank, which was as good or better than the best Soviet tanks, and one M1 was worth about 10 T-72s. Again, so even though it's an expensive tank, it gives us a tremendous advantage on the cost ratio. Is an early pioneer in what becomes stealth technology. Again, the Soviets have great radar defenses, but if we can design stuff that can actually get through it, just makes it obsolete. The F-16 and the F-18, to still a couple of backbones of our attack fighters and air superiority, he develops, outclass anything that the Soviets have. And these are not cheap, but they're done much more efficiently than all the money the Soviets were throwing at their military. And this is done with a dramatically decreased defense budget. And so Clements pioneers what becomes known as the second offset, really, but how America can do more with less, and lays a foundation for what later became the Reagan defense buildup. Again, the principle being, we're not just going to build and outspend the Soviets, we're going to outsmart them. He also, of course, brings a great web of relationships. He knew just about every allied leader in the defense sector because he had gotten to know know them as the SEDCO CEO and traveling the world as well. And so he also brings a deep commitment to our allies. He knows that our allies are also a source of strength, that America, is not at our, it's not at our best when we're going it alone, but allies are just a great force multiplier. And he brought that web of alliance relationships from the energy industry into the Pentagon and into geopolitics. So I think it's really a great life lesson about how these relationships and these skills really can be transferable across sectors. In this case, it's, I think, one of the untold great stories of America's eventual peaceful victory in the Cold War. Always goes back to inventing that new offshore drilling rig in South Texas in 1938.
So we're almost out of time. Let me ask one more question. You're the senior, you're considered the senior academic at the university in this role. So you're in the business of producing educated students and educated graduates. What do you wish that every newly minted Texas Ex under your term as provost would know about energy, national security, and human flourishing?
Okay, well, there's a lot there. I'll just say a few quick themes up top. First of all, I don't think there's other universities in the country that have some expertise in petroleum engineering, right? There's other universities in the country that will have expertise on energy and finance, like we have here at McCombs. There's other universities in the country that will have a reasonably good national security program, right? There's no other university in the country other than the University of Texas at Austin, where we're here right now, that has all of those. And so I would start with making sure all of our students appreciate what a unique ecosystem we have here at UT Austin, having that expertise across every different sector of energy and national security. And that's why, of course, gatherings like this today are so encouraging. But also, I want our students especially to appreciate, and this is a theme you're going to be hearing from President Davis in the coming months and years, and from me as well. We know that our country is divided right now in a lot of ways. We know that higher education is going through a very, very turbulent time. We are not naive about that. Even looking at some of the really difficult events of the past week are very stark and painful reminders of that. But we also want to keep this in perspective and understand that I would rather be at the University of Texas at Austin right now as a student than any other university in the country, let alone as the provost, because we have such a rich tradition here. We have a singular and unparalleled alumni base. We've got the resources like the KBH Center. We've got these vast academic resources. And our students have it here really, really good. And we want them to be grateful for that. But not just because they're at this great university, University of Texas, but because they're part of this wonderful, great country, the United States of America. And universities have over time done a great job of telling our students all the flaws with America. And as I said in another setting, I've got 4 degrees in American history. So if you want to stay all afternoon, I can tell all of our country's flaws. But what as universities we need to do a better job about doing is also telling our students, reminding them the greatness of America, right? The fact that our country can produce universities like this, or can produce companies like the ones represented here, can produce the job market, the employment opportunities that our students have, and can even be the world leader in energy production and innovation like we are. And we just take too many of those things for granted. And so kind of cultivating that spirit of gratitude in our students, which they want to hear, right? I don't want to sound too much like the cranky old man. Kids these days, they're not grateful enough, all right? So if I start doing that, it's time to find a new provost. Okay? But in a positive way, just remind our students of everything that they have to be grateful for. And they want to hear that. They're hungry for this. And those are the kind of things that can bring us back together as a country. And I think UT is really well positioned to lead the way in that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much.